Good afternoon, and welcome to Agrifood Conversations, brought to you by iSelect Fund, the Van Trump Report, the Yield Lab Institute, and Family Farms Group. My name is David Yoakum. I'm an associate here on the iSelect Fund Ventures team, and I'm excited to walk you through today's panel discussion and presentation. For anybody who's new to this call, Agrifood Conversations is all about driving innovation in agriculture. Each month, we highlight a specific theme, including emerging topics such as soil health, plant genetics, vertical farming, and aquaculture, to name a few. On today's Agrifood Conversations call, we are excited to present Justin Kolbeck, CEO and co-founder of The Wild Type. The Wild Type, fundamentally, growing and culturing cells to grow salmon, but without salmon and without actually any animals. And I'll let Justin dive more into that in a few minutes. A few process comments before we get rolling here. Each of you knows that companies are more likely to succeed with the right network of customers, talent, investors, and advisors. We've invited you to this call because you're some of the smartest and most talented people in Wild Type's marketplace. You are potential customers for Wild Type's products and services. You built or sold a company similar to Wild Type, or you are a sophisticated business person who understands the market and the challenges that Wild Type may face. Before we get started, we have a quick poll question to get a better idea who we have on the call today. Please take a few seconds to answer. And while we're doing that, I want to remind everyone that we are not soliciting investment. This presentation is to provide information around Wild Type's products and services to help them find customers, mentors, and other strategic relationships that can help them grow their business. Secondly, you're all on mute. You can use the chat window to ask a question, and after the formal part of the presentation, we will answer as many questions as time allows. Finally, this presentation is being recorded and will be available for replay. And without further ado, I'd like to hand things over to Justin Kolbeck, CEO and co-founder of The Wild Type. Justin, please feel free to take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, David. Just wanted to make sure that everybody can see the screen that says Introducing Wild Type Salmon and hear my voice.
I think we will be able to once the poll has closed.
Okay, great. Yeah, I see a little notice on here. Awesome. Well, thank you, David, for inviting me to this webinar. I'm really excited to share Wild Type's story with everyone. I thought I would start with just a very short introduction to myself, so you know kind of who's talking, and then I wanted to take you through the story behind Wild Type, why we got started, some of the progress that we've made, and then what lies ahead for the company. So just very quickly, a little bit about me. I actually started my career as a diplomat. I worked in a variety of countries, including Peshawar, Pakistan. I then did a tour in Melbourne, Australia. And my third overseas assignment was in Paktika province, Afghanistan, on a provincial reconstruction team very close to the Pakistani border. And it wasn't really until that year that I started thinking a lot about where our food comes from, because as some of you may know, Afghanistan faces one of the largest food security crises of just about any country on earth. And it's very impossible to, sort of extricate those sad realities from a lot of the insurgent issues that we faced over the course of the long conflict in that country. And so that really is where my passion for food comes from, and I think informs a lot of the work that we've done at Wild Type. After that, I went to business school and worked as a strategy consultant for about 4 years. So that's a little bit about my background. In terms of what we're doing at Wild Type, so our mission is to create the cleanest, most sustainable fish on the planet. And we can get into a little bit more about exactly how we're doing this, and I'll walk you through some of the challenges with today's current aquaculture system as context. So just a quick background. I'm sure most of the folks on this call are well aware of what's going on in the alternative protein sector. So alternative meat sales are up 20% year on year. This is data provided by the Good Food Institute. And what I like about this chart is that it shows that this is not just a coastal phenomenon, but in fact, we see double-digit growth, and in fact, north of 20% growth even in places like Texas, where one wouldn't necessarily think there would be a great demand for plant-based meat. We also see Beyond Meat having a tremendous year. So during their first 6 months really as a public company. And of course, Impossible Foods has also had a moment. They've launched in most Burger Kings nationwide and continue to penetrate even deeper into many different outlets of both fast casual and fine dining. Now, the question is, why is this happening? And why is it happening now? It's the question I get from a lot of my friends and relatives when they see the news about Impossible's progress and Beyond Meat stock price. I think most of us are aware that some of the challenges associated with conventional animal farming, greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of us, I think this summer, were awakened to some of the challenges from a food security perspective that our pork supplies faced with the outbreak of African swine fever in China, which, based on the latest reporting, wiped out as much as 50% of China's pork stocks. So I think one of the big challenges that we face is, not just a greenhouse gas emission or sustainability challenge, but also one where a large part of our meat supplies are unfortunately still quite susceptible to diseases such as this that now today still are having a meaningful impact on pork prices here in the United States. But what I actually want to talk about today is seafood and sort of where our fish comes from. So there are two sources for fish. The first is wild catch fish, and this is an infographic that was compiled by the New York Times based on UN FAO data in 2003. And you can see here that as of that date in 2003, a full 2/3 of our fish stocks had either completely collapsed or considered overfished. And overfished basically in this context means we're fishing beyond the regenerative capacity of those fish populations. So obviously this data is a bit older, but you can see the direction in which those trends are going. Despite the popular saying, there are in fact only so many fish in the sea. Now, the alternative is aquaculture, and there are some significant challenges with that as well. So the headline here is from an article in May published by the BBC about an algal outbreak in Norway, which wiped out literally millions of farmed salmon due to rising temperatures that caused an algal bloom, which unfortunately led to the loss of a large share of that country's salmon exports. And it's not just sort of susceptibility to changing global conditions. One of the biggest challenges that the aquaculture industry faces, which I know a lot of really interesting and innovative work right now is being invested into, is fish feed. So the vast majority of aquaculture feed comes from wild-caught fish, unfortunately, today. But as I said, I know that's a big priority for a lot of folks in the aquaculture industry to continue to improve and work on. And so for us, given the challenges that we see in the aquaculture industry and in wild catch farming, we thought perhaps there's another way or a third source of fish. And so our solution is to create real salmon meat built from the cell up. So all the photos I'll show today are actual pictures of our products. So this is a spicy salmon roll that we made, one of our very early prototypes earlier this year in January. And so, I want to just distinguish that this is not a plant-based alternative, but rather real salmon meat built from the cell up and cultured. We wanted to make sure that our salmon had all of the same benefits that you can find, and then indeed have driven a lot of consumers towards salmon as a protein source. And so in particular, one of the things that we pay a lot of attention to are the omega-3 fatty acids that are present in both wild-caught and to a lesser extent farmed fish, salmon in particular. And we wanted to make sure that we could offer a product that had a distinctive benefit over a lot of the fish on the market today. So specifically absent from our product are things like antibiotics and mercury and microplastics and other types of contaminants that unfortunately have become more common as pollution and other challenges have surfaced both in wild catch salmon as well as aquaculture. So we can ideally serve it in a way, as you can see presented here, raw without worrying about any kind of contaminants in the product. So simply the goal is to create the cleanest salmon on earth. So over the last year, we've been working with a number of chefs as we've started to make our early prototypes to really understand what they like and what they don't like about the product. And we've had a number of chefs already express a great deal of enthusiasm, and that number only continues to grow. You can see some of the intent and interest expressed by these three chefs written out here. I'd say one of the main points of feedback that we hear from chefs who will be our early consumers are that consumers these days are asking more and more questions about where the food comes from, and is this sustainable? And it's quite difficult to actually assure customers that the seafood choices that are on offer at many seafood restaurants are in fact sustainable, and have a clear, traceable source verifying that this is in fact the fish that is advertised. So I think a lot of chefs are very excited about the opportunity to add another sustainable option to their seafood menus that WildType can provide. So a question that we get frequently is why, given that you could have made anything on the planet, did you choose salmon? So the first reason is that salmon demand has been growing really rapidly. It's one of the fastest growing animal protein products globally. Importantly, it's also quite an expensive product. So as you might imagine, creating food in this way is currently an expensive endeavor. And so rather than trying to seek cost parity with something like chicken, which wholesale prices are below $1 a pound, it's much easier to start with something that already commands a bit more of a price premium in the market. Also, fish is the largest source of animal protein for us on planet Earth. So this is data from the food and agricultural industry. And fish and seafood is larger than beef and chicken combined, which is an exciting opportunity in terms of a market size. And according to our estimates, the global salmon market is worth more than 85 billion globally. So a question we often get is, of the companies like ours that are trying to develop animal products without animals, so from cells, why aren't there more working on fish? So this chart shows global meat production forecasts from the FAO by animal type, and as you can see again here, by far the largest in terms of millions of tons is fish. Yet we only see a total of 4 companies trying to develop cultured fish in this way, while there are many, many more and this is not an exhaustive list. There are even more working on poultry and more on beef. And the short answer to the question is difficult. So just to run through them quickly, fish have not traditionally been used for cell culture for any purpose, therapeutic or otherwise. And as a result, there just are very few anyway, established cell lines available for fish culture. So we've had to develop them on our own. Second, because fish are not mammals and we're mammals, less research has been done on fish developmental biology than has been done on human or mammalian biology. And so there was a great gap that we needed to bridge early on to understand exactly how fish meat forms. So what is that white banding? Where does that come from? What is the contribution of fat and muscle in animal tissue for fish? Those were all questions that we tackled early on. Today, all commercial cell culture uses mammalian systems, and so we've had to do a significant amount of work to adapt those processes to aquaculture, or fish in our case. The added complexity of complex fats like omega-3s is another challenge. So fish don't create omega-3s, they bioaccumulate them from these fatty acids that are created by algae that are then eaten by the krill, and then the small fish eat the krill, and the big fish eat the small fish, and so on. And so we had to devise a way to incorporate those same types of omega-3 acids into our fish cell feed. And then lastly, texture is a big challenge. So fish meat is just quite a bit different than that found in beef and chicken. So I wanted to talk just a minute about the WildType team. So today we're a team of 15 full-time folks. There's everybody here pictured. This was taken just a few weeks ago, as well as our mascot, Sammy the Salmon, down there, being held by Gillian in the red hair. And the team is co-led by the folks on this page. So my co-founder, Arya, is an MD PhD. He was working at the Gladstone Institutes just here in San Francisco, working on basically culturing functional heart cells and heart tissue before founding the company with me. Pallavi Srivastava came from industry, working at Agilent, and she's in charge of scaling and reducing our media costs. We hired a tissue engineer from the Bob Langer lab at MIT, Benny Larson, who leads our our tissue engineering team, and our cell bio team is co-led by Taryn Kim, who has spent more than 8 years at Rockefeller working specifically on fish developmental biology. As I mentioned, there just aren't very many people on Earth working on that. And Palmer Yu, who's a stem cell biologist who came from Gladstone with Arya. So in terms of the process, the quickest way to explain this is we can find highly regenerative self-renewing salmon lines from salmon roe. And then we cultivate those cells in fairly large fermentation tanks similar to beer brewing, which you can see here on the screen. In parallel, we've designed a way to fabricate scaffolds that allow tissues to elongate and form more complex tissues from natural proteins and carbohydrates. We then combine the cells with those scaffolds and allow them to mature into muscle and fat and stromal tissue before harvesting and preparing the product. So this is a very sort of zoomed out picture of our production process. In terms of how we're thinking about going to market, as I mentioned, we have already started working with a number of chefs. And in fact, in June of this year, we decided to host a tasting and to feature a seafood menu that the chefs felt was completely sustainable. So they picked a number of oysters from the Oregon coast. And if anybody on the call happens to know anything about oysters, they know that these are the sort of filter feeder extraordinaires. They leave the water cleaner than they find it. So to the chefs, these were great sustainable hors d'oeuvre for the menu. They sourced some albacore tuna that's grown locally on the Pacific coast. And then we featured wild type salmon 6 different ways because we wanted to demonstrate just how versatile the product can be across different culinary traditions. So one of the chefs comes from a Mexican culinary tradition, so she prepared a ceviche, which is one of her favorite dishes. We had Kyle there on the right, who is sort of a French-trained chef, and he did a tartare and a crudo. And then another chef who did most of her training in Hawaii and is really interested in Japanese preparations and prepared a poke bowl and some salmon rolls. And so this is the idea of how we would like to launch is, not necessarily in the fanciest restaurants, but in restaurants like the Olympia Oyster Bar that have a great reputation, that are community anchors and are places that people go to on a regular basis. And we're very open to continuing to work with chefs and people in the food industry who want to help us develop and improve our products before we get to market. And so I just wanted to close there in the interest of keeping enough time to dive into any questions that there might be on the line. So thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing any questions.
Fantastic. Thanks, Justin. As Justin alluded to, if you'd like to ask a question, there are 2 ways you can do so. One is by typing a question into the question box, and the other is by raising the hand-raising icon. If you raise your hand via the hand-raising icon, I will prompt you to unmute yourself so you can ask a question directly. But if you'd like to ask a question through the question box, please feel free to do so. While people are getting warmed up with any potential curiosities, I will go ahead and get things kicked off for our discussion. Justin, you talked a little bit about the different types of proteins that are out there that people are working on from a cultured meat standpoint. Are there any unique challenges or advantages about going after salmon protein or salmon cells that you might not see in other proteins? Like, are there pros and cons of going after one versus another?
Yeah, let me start with the pro. And I think this was something that we didn't appreciate, and I promise I'll give you a con too. This was something that I don't think we appreciated until we got well into this. So one of the big pros is that fish are cold-blooded, right? And so if you're growing and cultivating cells, you need to keep those cells at the temperature that exists in the body, right? So if you're working on beef or pork or chicken, basically any mammalian or bird species, you need to heat those cells up to 37 degrees Celsius, which is our body temperature. So if you think about the impact or the potential energy costs that would be associated with scaling a system like that, it's massively higher than working on a cold-blooded species where here in San Francisco, we could just retrofit an old brewery and keep fairly large tanks outside in the very temperate climate here, and our cells can tolerate a pretty wide range of temperature without having to heat, right? And so I think there's a huge benefit with respect to any cold-blooded fish. I don't imagine people are going to be interested in cold-blooded things like reptiles anytime soon, but versus the sort of warm-blooded equivalent. In terms of the cons, so I went through some of the big challenges that we face. Today, if I wanted to start a cultured chicken company, I can actually go to, believe it or not, I can go to a cell catalog and order some cell lines that have already been developed. And then, off I go, I can culture them and come up with a way to create my scaffold, put the cells down on the scaffold and help mature that tissue into the meat that we're used to eating from chicken, for example. That just doesn't exist with fish. And a large part of the reason is there hasn't been really until today a significant reason to develop fish cell lines. And so what that's meant for us was there was about a year of work that we had to spend in just establishing those cell lines and finding those special types of cells that can continue to grow, right? And so the idea is you go to the fish once, take a small bit of cells from the fish, and then once you find the right cells, they'll continue to propagate for years. And we still have cells going that have been growing in culture for more than a year and a half at this point.
Interesting. I guess I have a two-part question to follow up from there. So can you say more what you mean by different types of cell lines? I mean, is it specifically differentiation between protein versus fat, or is it something different than that? And then on the same thread, how do you go about improving yield and cell density across different types of cell types, particularly when you're working with salmon, which has complexities to which that makes up the actual structure of that actual meat?
Yeah. So answer them in order. So the first question was about what do we mean by different cell lines? With salmon, there are different types of salmon, right? So the kind that we're working with right now is coho salmon, which is a Pacific breed. Also on the Pacific line of salmon are things like Chinook or king salmon, sockeye. There's the less popular chum or pink salmon. Each of those different species require extra work to develop a cell line for them, right? And then even within one type of fish, like coho, for example, you can find cell lines that grow faster than others, right? Or very importantly, and this is a segue into your second question, can grow without attachment to an anchor point. And so your question about density is a really critical one. So if anybody on the call has ever seen the images of Mark Post's first cultured burger that he made in the Netherlands in, I think, 2014, I hope I don't get that date wrong, but it was about 5 years ago, he stacked up stacks and stacks and stacks of plastic sort of two-dimensional flasks, meaning there was a wide surface area, but only one cell deep. And so you can imagine trying to scale enough to even supply one restaurant, you'd have to have houses full of these stacks because they can only be one cell layer deep. So a critical component in terms of scaling is learning how to cultivate cells in 3 dimensions where they're not kind of stuck to a planar surface. And so part of the reason that we have to spend a lot of time on cell line development is that some cells are just more susceptible to being able to grow without those anchor points than others. And so what that's allowed us to do is to move from those flat surfaces that the original burger was cultivated in to something that looks a little bit more akin to a fermentation tank. Because you can imagine in 3 dimensions, you're not stuck with just one cell, right? And therefore your conversion ratio of the feed or the cell culture medium in our case to the output of the biomass that we're looking in terms of meat can be much higher. So that's how we think about improving cell density. And interestingly, it's quite similar. It's a very similar challenge that I think land farmers have and aquaculture farmers have, which is I want to get the maximum amount of saleable weight for the input that I put into the animals in the form of feed. And that exact same analogy applies for creating fish in this way.
Got it. That's really interesting. The next area that I'm interested in is, there's a question that I ask a lot of companies that are either in cellular agriculture, cultured meats, synthetic biology. there's consumer trends that are pushing for animal-free products that are enabling these kinds of products to make it into market, and the market is in a pull. But one thing I'm always curious about is whether or not a product can become simply an identical product to what's in the market, or if it can begin to differentiate from what's in the market once it's in there. So obviously having a plant-based burger is a great way to introduce that type of product to the market, but are there other product categories that maybe we haven't even thought of before? So I think about for salmon, salmon has all these wonderful properties, and does Wild Type see there being products in the future that are, an omega-3 enhanced salmon or a protein enhanced salmon once you've sort of gotten into the market and have the acceptance as a replacement? Are those the kinds of things that would be possible with the platform you're building?
Good question. Yeah, so I'll start just by saying that I think from a differentiation perspective, what we're excited about is that I think this will be the first salmon that delivers not only a consistent amount of omega-3 fatty acids, right? That's getting it from nature, or even from a fish farm. It varies significantly from fish to fish. So we can make that consistent to begin with, and we can eliminate some of the contaminants that I know a lot of consumers are worried about, things like heavy metals such as mercury, microplastics. I know antibiotics is not a big part of much aquaculture today, but it still does exist to a certain point, so we can ensure that there are no antibiotics in the product, right? So I think early differentiation for us would be, a nutritionally equivalent product without many of the drawbacks that people are worried about when it comes to fish. And then, in the longer run, I think there might be some opportunities, like you said, for omega-3 enhanced fish, and potentially chefs who have a very specific use in mind, and being able to produce every single time consistent food and meat that doesn't vary from batch to batch, that isn't sensitive to the climate, that isn't sensitive to the seasons, I think is something that a lot of people in the food industry are really excited about. We haven't given much thought, to be really honest with you, about sort of making something quote unquote better than what exists in nature. For us, our first quest is to, get as close as possible to this pristine, beautiful animal in the salmon.
Well, it's actually a good segue to one of the questions that we have from the audience today. About beautiful and pristine fish. The question is, why did you choose salmon versus tuna, which is a much more overfished and endangered species of finfish?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the truth is, we didn't want to spread our efforts too broadly. It's really hard to make one good food product and commercialize it, let alone many at the same time. So we had to make some tough decisions about which fish species to focus on. We chose salmon because, at least here in the United States, it's the second most consumed seafood after shrimp. It is quite expensive, as I was mentioning earlier. So in terms of getting to break even and good unit economics, which I know are not necessarily the most popular words in Silicon Valley startups these days, but it's something that we care a lot about in the very near term. It's much easier when we've got another order of magnitude of cost, and shrimp, for example, is quite cheap compared to salmon. It's importantly one of the most versatile fishes out there. So we eat salmon in small slices on our bagel in the form of lox. We kind of grind it up into our cream cheese. In the Nordic countries, we turn it into fish paste for open-faced sandwiches. We have it minced up in a sushi roll. We have it on a bed of rice for our favorite piece of sashimi. We sort of smoke it on a cedar plank and on the barbecue. There just aren't very many fish like that give us the range of potential products that we could create with salmon. And that was something that was really exciting to us, because we don't have to just launch with a commodity product. We can launch with a value-added product that's ready to consume in all the different ways that salmon are. And just a kind of a shameless plug. So I live in the Pacific Northwest in Seattle, which is salmon territory, and a lot of people there are really worried about the impact that overfishing has had on the local orca population, for example. And so being able to do something to contribute to this very large environmental challenge was something that motivated me personally. So those are some of the reasons, but the short answer is, we absolutely need to expand and deliver these products to many other types of species like tuna, like eel, for example, which is very difficult to farm as quickly as we can.
Excellent. Another question we have from the audience that does touch on another really important point that I'm sure you've been asked before is as you go to market, how will your product be labeled to allow the consumer the opportunity to determine whether or not to purchase it? And will there be any regulations that will mandate declarations on the packaging itself? And I guess to tie one extra add-on to that, in the way that you're working with chefs today, how are the regulations different there than as if you were delivering in the store?
Yeah, it's a really wonderful question. And the truth is, FDA has not yet, which would be our regulator since we're fish, has not yet decided exactly which labeling conventions will appear for these products. But I can say, we are not interested in confusing customers in terms of what this is. We will describe, in our own words, in a way that FDA is comfortable with, how these products were made, right? We want people to know that this was not produced in an aquaculture facility, that this is not wild caught fish, but this is made in a third way. And it's, the onus falls on us to explain that process in a way that gets consumers really excited about what we're offering. And truthfully, that's something that we spend a lot of time thinking about and working on. And so, we are very excited to enter a discussion with FDA about the ways in which we would describe our process on packaging. But it's in our interest to differentiate our products from other sources of salmon, and we will certainly do that. I just hope that the process doesn't become politicized. And we're forced to use language that is not objectively neutral, but like having to use the term lab grown, for example, which is actually factually incorrect. We're not going to be growing the product in a lab. Would be really unfortunate and would significantly disadvantage us. But we're much more interested in describing the process in the way that FDA does. For example, I think for now they call it cell cultured food products, which is accurate and fine with us. We also don't have any interest in sort of casting any negative light on the current aquaculture or wild-caught farm fishing industry, because those are important sources of this really important fish. So yeah, I think our goal is to label it objectively correct to make sure consumers know what they're buying. And then, like I said, the challenge for us is to describe it in such a way that gets people excited about our products.
Excellent. Well, I'll pause here for a moment in the event that there was another question, but I believe it was covered by your response there. It was a question about the commitment to share with the consumer the origin of the actual source of protein and salmon, which sounds like that is part of the intention, unless I'm mistaken.
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
Okay. Well, if there's any other questions from the audience, I'll pause for just a moment. But while we are doing that, Justin, we always want to ask founders and CEOs who join us on Agrifood Conversations what the audience can do for them. Oftentimes it can stretch from anywhere from talent to industry introductions to advisors. So what are some ways in which the audience could be helpful to you today?
Yeah, I have one request for the audience, and that is, if you know someone who knows their way around the kitchen, either has a restaurant or is a chef, we are regularly producing prototypes for tasting as we continue to improve and iterate. Can just show the menu again here from the tasting in June, and we would really welcome the opportunity to share a product with you, talk about exactly how it's made, and really hear your feedback on what you like and what you don't like. The way that I like to think about this is, we're sort of in the second year of a 10 or 20 year journey to create a really delicious product. And the more talented hands working with the product that we have, the better. So that would be my request, is if you know a chef, if you know a restaurant owner, if you know anybody in the food industry who is interested in learning more about these products and trying them and potentially co-branding with us, we'd be really delighted to meet them.
Got it. Excellent. We did have one more question come in. I'm going to rephrase it slightly. Is there anything that you're doing currently on the technology side to quantify flavor profiles in your cells or in your products?
Yes, actually. We just started doing triangle tests and sensory panels for these products internally at first. In fact, one of our food scientists just held a kind of a sensory 101 training with the rest of the team here, which was a lot of fun. It was Kim. Let me show you a picture of her. She actually has a yeah, this is her sort of fourth from the right, hidden behind the guy with the wild type hoodie. She's a food scientist by training and was kind of teaching the rest of us about how to detect these really faint notes of salmon. And for those of you who've had the pleasure of having super fresh salmon, you know, the sort of quote unquote fishy smell is actually not the first note. They're actually very subtle notes, things like cucumber and like wet earth and all these other things that I would have never thought to be associated with salmon that expert tasters can detect. And so we're sort of at the point now where we can make enough of these products to be able to taste them and hone in on what in the upstream production process is leading to different flavor notes. You know, obviously we think it's to a large extent a function of the feed that we're feeding the cells, but there could be other parts of the production process as well that could be influencing that. So we're super interested in continuing to dive deep on that, and we're really only in the first part of that journey.
Well, and that's just a really interesting discussion in and of itself. And there's a number of companies out there today that are trying to figure out ways to better quantify flavor and sense for both the pharmaceutical and for the food industry, and I'm excited to see how that ends up being adopted sort of in both the startup level and broadly in the industry. So another exciting area to follow up on. But Justin, I really want to thank you for taking the time to join us today. It's some really fantastic, exciting, and frankly important work that you're doing at WildType, and we appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. And for those who are participating on the webinar, we thank you as well. We really appreciate your attendance from week to week. If you'd like to learn more about the work that WildType's doing and the exciting work of cellular agriculture and cultured meats, please let us know by answering the following poll. As a reminder, we host these calls every week, Thursdays at 3 p.m. Central Time. You can register for Agrifood Conversations webinar series by going to agrifoodconversations.com. As usual, a replay of this webinar will be emailed to you in the next 24 hours. And if you know others that may want to see this webinar on replay, they'll be able to do so via agrifoodconversations.com within the next 24 hours. But otherwise, thank you again to Justin. Thank you to our audience, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you.